Welcome to the Ontario Trillium Foundation's Collective Impact Granting Stream Introduction to Collective Impact webinar presented by Tamarack. We hope this webinar will guide your collective impact work around governance, engagement, and evaluation, and help you provide insight into what phase you are at, as well as next steps for your organization, community, cause, or group. Thank you all so much for joining us today. I'd like to introduce Liz Weaver, the Director for the Learning Center and Tamarack's Vice President. Liz helps initiatives develop their frameworks of change, supports and guides their projects, and helps connect them with other comprehensive community collaborations. She has also been Director of the Hamilton Roundtable on Poverty Reduction, which was recognized for the Canadian Urban Institute's David Crombie Leadership Award in 2009. In her career, Liz has held leadership positions with YMCA Hamilton, Volunteer Hamilton, and Volunteer Canada. I will now turn it over to Liz for the start of our webinar.
Great, thanks so much, Mark, and hi everybody. So glad that you can join us. Even though this slide says that we're going to talk about the preconditions of collective impact, we're not. We're going to be talking about the phases of collective impact. I see that we have a typo on our first slide, so I apologize for that, but the rest of the content will be fine. I guarantee that. So what we're going to do in this webinar is we're going to review the 5 phases of collective impact. We're going to learn about how the phases of collective impact can really help you plan and unleash your collective impact efforts, and we're going to talk about some tools that might help you navigate the 5 phases in your work. So those are the kind of 3 big goals of the webinar today. Before we dive into the phases of collective impact, I know that some of you might have attended the Trillium workshops that we held about collective impact across the province of Ontario, but some of you might also be new to this this call and this work as well. So we're going to start off with the definition. So collective impact is the commitment of a group of important actors from different sectors to a common agenda, which is really focused on solving a specific social problem or a specific social opportunity using a structured form of collaboration. And there's some really important elements to that definition. One is that it is a commitment, right? That the folks that you gather around your collective impact table have to be committed to working in a kind of a collective impact way. They should be people who have influence, who can help you move the needle on whatever issue or opportunity that you're wanting to move the needle on. And that collective impact is a bit of a structure. It's a structured form of collaboration, as we're going to hear about in a minute. So that's what collective impact is. We know, as we're doing this work, at Tamarack and with our colleagues at the Ontario Trillium Foundation, we're also starting to kind of figure out what it isn't. So collective impact is not collaboration as usual. It really is a structured form of collaborating differently, and so often when we sit around collaborative tables, we are either single sector, so we bring all the people that we know in the sector, or there might be a couple of sectors around that table. Collective impact suggests that you need to have all sectors represented around the table. So if you're doing work, trying to move the needle in your community around a particular issue, depending on who is engaged in the issue, you might have the health sector, you might have the business sector, you might have the faith communities, you might have the education sector, you might have community safety sector. So to really think about, whatever issue we're working on, who are the best and most appropriate players to have around our table, and that's different from collaboration as we know it. It isn't, as is also noted on this slide, it isn't just a single sector approach. It does require multiple sectors involved. And I just want to pause here for a second. The reason why we want multiple sectors engaged around these collective impact tables is that each of these sectors has a perspective on the issue. So if you're a citizen and you have the experience of the issue, so let's say I was just in Montana with a collective impact initiative called Graduation Matters Montana. So if you're the parent of a student in high school or you're a high school student as well, you should be at these tables because, you know, what the table is trying to accomplish impacts you as well. So, you know, so having that voice at the table really helps us understand these issues in a better way. It's also not a focus on individual programs or single focus solutions. It's really trying to unleash all of the energy of the community to move the needle on these bigger issues. So collective impact, we said that it was a structured form of collaboration or community change. So this is what the structure looks like. There are 3 preconditions embedded in the structure. The preconditions are influential champions. So who are those people from the different sectors that we need to have at the table? And it's really focused on the issue that we're wanting to move the needle on. Is what we're concerned about, is it urgent and important to the rest of the community? And then how do we know that, right? What's the data telling us about the issue so that we can create kind of that narrative around urgency and importance? And then the third precondition is adequate resources. And these preconditions are pretty pivotal to collective impact. They're pivotal because if you address these preconditions before you start your collective impact work, you're going to be much more successful during the path of your collective work. And we'll come back to them because they actually fit within the first phase of collective impact, as you'll see in a few minutes. And then the bulk of the structure is that there are 5 core conditions of collective impact. And the 5 core conditions you can see on the slide here, but we'll walk through them really quickly. The first one is around a common agenda. So what is it that we all agree to do in common? What is our shared work? What is the issue that we're going to focus on, and then how are we going to, what actions are we going to undertake in order to move this issue forward? The second condition of collective impact is the agreement of all the folks around the table to both identify where they want to move the needle, but also collect data and measure results consistently as you go. And this really says, you know, if you have a variety of different partners, let's say you're working on this notion of graduation matters, not only do you need to know, you know, from the perspective of the state of Montana what the graduation rates are, but you also want to know how individual schools are doing, what are some of the success stories, and all of that kind of comes in under this rubric of shared measurement. And I'll tell you the story. The folks in Montana were able to achieve through their collective impact work the highest ever high school graduation rate in the state, which was 85.6%. Last year they broke through and they were at 85.4%, and this year they achieved 84.6%. So they're slowly moving the needle further and further along. The third condition of collective impact is mutually reinforcing activities, and this is where you unleash the capacity that already exists in your communities. And so, you know, what you want to think about, okay, so what can our various partners do, or what are they doing already that could, if they did a little bit more, could contribute to us achieving our common agenda and measuring progress as we go. The fourth condition is continuous communications, and so this condition really says, you know, if we have lots of partners sitting around our collective impact tables and we're engaged with the community in trying to drive this change forward, that we really have to pay attention to communications and really make sure that our communications are consistent, that they're open, that they build trust, and that they appreciate that folks are contributing to moving the common agenda forward. And then the final element in the framework of collective impact, or the final condition of collective impact, is backbone support. And backbone support is really the resources, really understanding the resources that it will take to move the needle, and really putting those resources in place so that collective impact work isn't just done from the side of everybody's desk, but it moves to the middle of the desk. So that's the kind of framework of collective impact. It has these 3 preconditions, and then it has these 5 conditions. So as you're doing the work in the community, you've got to think about, okay, to what degree are we achieving, you know, progress on both the 3 preconditions and the 5 conditions. So that's, you know, that really sets the table for collective impact. One of the things that that has also been developed as the folks who designed the collective impact framework, FSG, began to watch how collective impact was unfolding in communities, is they started to say, you know, not only do we have these kind of 3 preconditions and these 5 conditions, but there's actually, it doesn't all just plunk itself down in a community and away you go. In fact, there seems to be phases to this work. And so the folks at FSG met with collective impact organizations or collaboratives in Cincinnati and Northern Kentucky with backbone leaders, and they said, tell us about your work. And they did a little bit of analysis of these collective impact initiatives, and this actually led them to thinking about how this work evolves in communities over time. And so they initially came up with 4 phases to collective impact, but most recently in the last year, they said, you know, in retrospect, there's actually 5 phases. So we have at Tamarack developed a bit of a self-assessment tool for the 5 phases. And the self-assessment tool, which you will get in the post-webinar email, is really designed to provide you with some of the key elements required for each of the 5 phases. It's an opportunity for you and your team to self-assess your progress, and there is also a reflection opportunity at the end of the tool. And we're going to spend a bit of time on this webinar looking at the phases of collective impact and some elements of the self-assessment tool. So the 5 phases are really detailed on this slide, and what's really interesting across these 5 phases are the components for success. So the folks at FSG and other folks that are engaged in collective impact work say, you know, even though we know that we have the 3 preconditions and the 5 conditions of collective impact, we've also got to think about, okay, we're bringing people around a table, we're talking to one another, we're going to be making decisions. So what do we have to pay attention to from a governance and infrastructure perspective? Because we've got this backbone, we've got, you know, key leaders, influential champions around our table. So that's a component for success that was identified. The second component for success was around strategic planning. So what, you know, in order for us to actually make progress on the issues that we're trying to make progress on, what are the strategies that we're going to put into place, and how do we articulate those strategies in a way that our community can become engaged with it, with those strategies? The third component for success is around engagement, right? And I think, you know, one of the things that as we watch collective impact evolve in Canada and the United States, one of the things that we have noticed, in Canada we've been pretty strong at, you know, really identifying the powerful role that citizens can play in growing collective impact initiatives in Canada, particularly around poverty and around youth suicide prevention and other areas. In the United States, it's been a little bit of a, to some degree, a bit of a slower process, but there's been a huge conversation in the last year about equity and equity of voice. And I think that that is really tied to this issue of community engagement. How do we make sure that all voices are represented as we begin to evolve this community change, this community impact strategy? And so it's a critical component for success. And then the final component for success is evaluation and improvement, which actually really nicely ties into shared measurement. So if you think about these components for success, and you overlay them on the 5 conditions of collective impact, governance and infrastructure ties really nicely to the condition of backbone support. Strategic planning really ties nicely into shared measurement and mutually reinforcing activities. Community engagement really ties into continuous communications and community engagement, and then evaluation and improvement again ties back into both shared measurement and mutually reinforcing activities and the initiative as a whole. So there's kind of some really nice links between the components of success and the 5 conditions of collective impact. So I just wanted to start off there, and then you can see the phases, right? So a good collective impact, or a typical, not even a good, a typical collective impact initiative will go through these phases, not in as linear a fashion as this looks. It's a little bit more emergent, but a typical collective impact initiative will take about 3 to 5 years to make their way through each of the 5, all of the 5 phases, right? So it really depends. We've certainly seen collective impact initiatives get through phase 1 quite quickly if they have good cohesion in their community already. However, if they're a community that doesn't have as many connected tissues, they don't have as many leaders in the community, or they haven't done a lot of work together in the past, they might spend a little bit more time on phase 1, right, in the assessing readiness and getting people to the table and talking about the urgency of the issue, those kinds of things. Phases 2 and 3 are really the developing your plan, mapping the landscape, developing your plan, creating your common agenda. And some groups can move fairly quickly through phases 2 and 3 if they have a fairly specific issue that they are focused on, right? So it might be that, yes, you want to work on the issue of obesity, but you have already identified that you're going to work on childhood obesity and you have the data in place. Then you can, once you've begun to think about, okay, what's going to be inside my box versus outside of the scope of my collective impact work, you probably can get through those phases very quickly. Some communities, however, say, yes, we want to do something on the issue of homelessness, but they haven't necessarily had a lot of the players at the table, or they haven't really defined in the issue of homelessness what their specific work is going to be. That can mean that you're going to spend a little bit more time in phases 2 and 3 in terms of defining the issue, figuring out your strategic approach, and really working your way through that issue and engaging the community around that and identifying baseline data from which you're going to work. Phase 4 is beginning the implementation. So this is, you've got your plan in place, you've got good agreement in your plan, you've done some reinforcing loops where people have given you feedback, and then that's really the execution of the plan. And execution, so phase 4, typically the begin of execution and moving into sustain, action, and impact, that can be a 2 to 3 year cycle. So you can see how, it doesn't take very long to get through 3 to 5 years to get through these 5 phases of collective impact. And we would say at Tamarack that even with phase 5, you might be sustaining some of the actions, but there might be some actions that as you went along, you said, oh, that really didn't work, so we're going to let it go and we're going to bring something new on. I was just doing some work with a group recently, and I said, so in these 5 phases, where do you think you are? And so it was really interesting to me. They said, well, part of our work is actually, we're quite far down the road in some elements of our work, so we might be phase 3 or 4, but in other elements of our work, we're still back at phase 1, right? So I think that that's a really typical response when you look at the phases to say, okay, so in our governance and infrastructure, yeah, we've convened the community leaders and we've got the right champions, but then a couple of our champions leave, so we've got to go back a little bit. So it's really kind of thinking about this more as, here's the basic structure of the work, but you can be, as you unfold your collective impact, you can actually kind of dance across the phases in one area or another. So the next slide, in the tool that we will be sending you post this webinar, we actually go through each of the 4 components for success. One of the elements of the tool is to go through each of the 4 components for success and actually begin to not only describe that component, give you some questions to consider, talk about the goal, and this slide is for the first phase, right? So here's the goal in this first phase. Here are some indicators of, and this is what indicators of success might look like. So the tool is really an opportunity to kind of prompt for you some thinking about what you should be looking at in each of these kind of components of success, and also begin to have you ask each other some questions. One of the things that we'd like to ask you at Tamarack is, if you do take this tool and you apply it to your collective impact work, give us some feedback, because it's a tool in development, right? So we've done some of the thinking about it. We've looked at different collective impact initiatives, and we've kind of posted these questions, but they're not a comprehensive list of questions. They are really more discussion starters for you. It's really an opportunity for you and your collective impact team, your backbone, and your leadership team to begin the discussion, not to end the discussion. So I'm going to spend a bit of time in each of the 4 areas. So the first one is with governance and infrastructure. This component is focused on ensuring that your group shares responsibility and leadership and is clear about how and who makes decisions. The aim, when possible, should be to strive for a consensus that honors multiple perspectives. And this is really critical in collective impact work, because you are going to have those influential champions. If you structured your collective impact effort in the right way, you're going to have those influential champions around your key leadership table. They're not always going to agree on things. So, you know, you've got to, and particularly when you're dealing with issues that have a little bit of stigma attached to them. So, for example, you know, if you're dealing with the issue of teen suicide, the hospital sector might have one way of addressing the issue, the education sector has another, service providers have another, youth might have another, and families might have another. And so you can see that, you know, when you're trying to say, okay, so we should develop a strategy that really focuses on, you know, youth, that might not necessarily fit into the perspectives of some of the other players around the table. So you've got to kind of get to consensus about what does that look like, and how does that tie into, you know, the perspectives of the healthcare sector or the education sector or the service providers or the parents, right? So you can really see in that description how they are connected together. And so the questions to consider really look at who are we and how do we work together. What are our minimum agreements to work well together? What are practices that we can put in place to build trust amongst each other? And what are some of the structures that we really need to define so that we can work well together? And so we've identified some indicators of success here. So clarity, so it's documented that the group has identified how they will work together, how decisions are made, what structures are in place, that there is a focus by the governance and infrastructure table at looking at trust and building trust, and that there are values and principles. And that really aligns quite nicely with the conditions of collective impact. The second area of success is around strategic planning, and so you can see it follows fairly the same format here. It's really on helping your group be clear about what they are trying to accomplish together and how. And so some of the questions that are raised is what's your group's aspiration? How can we accomplish this change together? What are some key actions that we should take? And so again, you can see some early indicators of success. The third component, community engagement or community involvement. So it really is focused on ensuring that your group, the collective impact group, has engaged diverse perspectives so that you can view the issue from a holistic perspective or from a systems perspective, right? So what is preventing, us from achieving higher and higher graduation rates? What are the things that are preventing it, and what are some of those things that are enabling it? And so there are some questions here and some indicators for success. And the indicators here are really important. So community involvement or community engagement is really about trying to create this notion of shared ownership of the issue. One of the things I like to say, because I used to, as you heard from Mark in the introduction, he said, Liz has done this work in Hamilton around the Hamilton Roundtable for Poverty Reduction. And one of the things I used to say to the Hamilton Roundtable all the time is, 40 people sitting around the roundtable in Hamilton will never solve poverty. We'll make some progress, but we're never going to get to that final achievement. It only is when you can think about collective impact work as a community-wide civic movement, right? That it isn't just the work of the backbone and the leadership table, but that you're actually trying to get true shared ownership of the community around this issue. And that's when you can achieve real success. And that there is consensus on a common agenda and a set of shared actions to make the common agenda a reality. The final component of success is evaluation and improvement. And so the descriptor really talks about tracking progress. It's about using the data and the information to adjust and make changes accordingly. So it's not only about tracking the progress, but it's also about sense making. So if the data is telling you something, what does that mean? If the data is trending in one direction or another, you've got to step back and you've got to say, okay, so what were the things that we were doing, this collective impact initiative was doing, that are contributing to that kind of trending, right, in one direction or another? And in Montana, that's what they were doing earlier this week. They had gathered 150 of their key stakeholders, and they were saying, okay, so we've made this progress. What are the things that we did in each of these 58 communities across Montana that led us to the highest graduation rates that we've achieved in our state? So that is critical because when you see success in one community or another community, you can't just take it and plunk it in the other community, but you can say, okay, so what happened in that community that made it successful? And what were some of the barriers they encountered that maybe they could overcome, and would that work in another community? I would say with any collective impact work that you guys are involved in, it doesn't actually really matter what the issue is. There are lots of groups out there that are likely doing collective impact work that is quite similar to yours. So they might be a little bit further along. Doesn't mean that you can take and plunk what they did into your context, but you can look at what they did. You can look at how they've come up with their common agenda, how they've structured their backbone, what their plan looks like, and you can say, what are the elements that made that successful, and then how can we maybe utilize some of those in the work that we're doing? So in terms of questions to consider, what is changing, and are we learning from these changes? How are we changing or influencing policies, cultures, norms, and systems? And what impact are we having? Are we actually seeing, our collective impact initiative having an impact? And we're going to have a webinar later in this series where we're going to go much more deeply into shared measurement. And this will tie very nicely into this phase's conversation. Some of the indicators of success in this element: learning is captured, it's documented, and evidence of progress and impact is measured and communicated. So those are the 4 components for success that are at the very beginning of the phases document. The other element that we have that we've built into the tool is, I'm just going to jump one slide ahead and then I'll come back, is this kind of self-assessment checklist. And so I've pulled out phase 1, the pre-startup phase, and FSG has identified that this kind of phase 1 pre-startup phase is about 12 to 18 months in length. And so we've developed as part of our self-assessment tool, a bit of a checklist, right? And so we've taken those components of success and we've said, okay, so in phase 1, this is what it might look like, right? So if you're in the early startup, if the focus is on engagement and exploration, under governance and infrastructure, you want to make sure that you have leadership from multiple perspectives, that you have commitment of leaders from multiple sectors, and that you're starting to put into play principles and practices that guide your work. And so the table, you can use it as a tool for where you are right now, or you can use this as a kind of a self-assessment tool to guide where you're strong and where maybe some of your weaknesses are. And so this is an opportunity for you to do that. So the self-assessment tool describes each of the phases of collective impact. It identifies the essential deliverables that can be found related to governance, planning, community engagement, evaluation, and improvement. And part of the tool also, the final section of the tool also allows for individual and group reflection. So for example, if you are one of the folks that is leading your backbone, you're staffing the backbone component of your collective impact initiative, you might just use this tool as a way of assessing where you think the collective impact initiative is. So people can do that individually. You might hand it out to members of your leadership table and say, okay, so let's spend a bit of time talking about where we are, So let's figure out first what phase are we in, or let's do a little bit of a self-assessment and then share that collectively and do a bit of a group reflection. As I mentioned, at Tamarack, we really view this as a living tool, as a tool where you guys who are doing the work of collective impact can take it to your tables, and then we hope that you will provide us with feedback and that you'll help us kind of continue to evolve it so that it becomes a tool that's really helpful to communities that are trying to delve into this collective impact work. Another thing that I wanted to point out, so they're not all just numbered 1. As I pulled the tool into the slide, it seemed to have just readjusted the numbering on each of the sections. But as you kind of look through each of the phases of the tool, you will get this kind of same structure, right? So there will be 3 or 4 things to assess your collective impact initiative under governance and infrastructure, under strategic planning, under community involvement, under evaluation and improvement. And we view these as a kind of a bit of a checklist to kind of help you plan your work going forward and to really see what you've done successfully. So each of the phases has a similar kind of template like this, and as you kind of move across the 4 phases, different items appear in the checklist. And so that again is something that you can share with other team members or with people that are sitting around your leadership table. So that's that's kind of the core essence of the tool. One of the things that we've learned at Tamarack, as we've been working with a variety of different collective impact initiatives in Canada and the United States, we really have heard this phrase of dancing across the phases, right? That people say, yeah, it seems quite linear, but that isn't how collective impact works. And so it's not as linear as the phases might look, and that's okay. There's lots of, permission for you where there is energy to jump forward, and where you're stuck a little to maybe spend a bit of time saying, okay, we really got to shore up our governance, right? So let's spend a bit of time really documenting some of the core elements of our governance strategy. So feel free to not feel so bound by the phases. The phases, I think, are really opportunities for you to see that this work evolves over time and that that it looks different in each of the phases. The 4 elements are consistent across all phases, and they are also very critical to all phases. So you really do need to be thinking about, okay, so what is the governance that we have to put into place? And we all know that as collective impact initiatives evolve or collaborative initiatives evolve, you know, especially if we're working on a 3 to 5 year time period, the people that you start off with are not necessarily the people that you're going to end up with at the end of 5 years, because lives happen, right? And so how do we have a good enough governance structure that helps us kind of navigate the ebbs and flows from a governance perspective? And similarly with community engagement, for example, there are things in the early phases where, or times in the early phases where we really want to engage the community deeply around the development of the plan. And then as we get to phases 3, 4, and 5, we want to engage the community deeply on the delivery of the plan, right? So it's they kind of have different roles that we're playing across the different phases, and that's true for each of the 4 elements. And I think that the one thing I wanted to also speak to before I turn it over to my colleague at the Trillium Foundation is that, you know, I love the fact that the Ontario Trillium Foundation is providing collective impact funding opportunities that really reflect the 5 phases of collective impact. And so we're going to hear a little bit now from Tracy. Oh, we're going to go to Tracy first, and then we'll come back to our questions and answers. So we're going to hear from Tracy Robertson, who is a strategy lead with the Ontario Trillium Foundation. She works in the Prosperous People impact area, and she's going to talk to us a little bit about how Trillium is envisioning and funding collective impact. So over to you, Tracy.
Okay, thanks, Liz. Hi, everyone. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how we're aligning the collective impact stream and what that's about for Trillium Foundation. First of all, who we are. Our mission is to build healthy and vibrant communities throughout Ontario, if you're not familiar with us. And how we do that is we strengthen the capacity of the voluntary sector through investments. Our impact to date is really we invest in over 1,000 organizations every year, and we expect in the next decade that we'll invest about $1 billion in the sector and in the community. So what's interesting for us too is when in our strategy and our investment strategy, we have a couple of different granting streams, and one is the seed, where we're seeding ideas, and the other is this growing, that we're growing and scaling a model. The one that we're going to talk about today, though, is one that's quite unique that we have designed very much and aligned with what Liz is talking about in the collective impact approach, and this is where we're bringing fundamental change to collective action. And we have, similar to the work in collective impact, what we've done is establish 3 different areas where you could come into play. So it's 3 different stages, and one is that we're defining the impact at that beginning stage, sort of that groundwork phase, and where that impact you would be looking at further defining the issue, building trust and relationships, possibly identifying who's involved, the community outreach, and defining your leadership committee, etc. The second stage we're looking at is organizing for impact, and this is where we'd look at confirming common agenda and building out the theory of a change and more that cross-governance model, creating the backbone support, etc. And the third one would be delivering impact, and this is where it would be actually putting it, as a lot of the conversation has been today, in terms of putting it into practice and learning and developing that learning agenda and implementing it. We have, this is the work we've been doing we just started it for the last little while, but in terms of this information that I'm sharing with you right now, this will all be on the website. It'll be accessible. We're just refining it now, and it will be available over the next few weeks.
What I'm really excited about, Tracy, is how it aligns really nicely with the phases work. So I think the early funding that you have available is really very clearly aligned with kind of that first phase. The second pot of funding is, you know, maybe phase 2 and a little bit into 3, and then the third is 3, 4, and 5. So it's a kind of a nice alignment from plan to execution.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Really good.
So, and if there's any other information too, just anybody who has any questions at all can call our support center as well, or talk with a local program manager in your area to discuss any initiative, or any one of us as strategy leads that we have at the foundation.
Yeah, which is great. So we're maybe going to just flip back to our question and answer slide for a minute. So I don't know, Mark, if we have any questions, but if there's anybody on the line who has a question either about the phases of collective impact or about how Trillium is looking to fund or is funding collective impact work, we would be open to spending the next couple of minutes answering some of your questions. So Mark, did we get any questions posted in our chat box?
We did, actually. We got some reflections as well as some questions. And I think that, Liz, it'd be great if you could comment on the reflections that came through. This actually came from Mindset Center on Twitter. And the reflection is, equity of voice is critical in community engagement. Just wondering, Liz, if you could comment a bit on that particular reflection.
I think I absolutely agree with that. You know, the voice of individuals who are being most directly impacted by the issue, the problem, or the opportunity that you're trying to build your collective impact initiative around, having their voice at the table is pivotal to really getting to deeply understanding that issue, problem, or opportunity, right? So if you don't have that person or those people, those individuals represented at the table, you will not have a true kind of 360 view of that issue. You also, they bring a very good sense of also not only opportunities for moving forward, but also some of the barriers that they're encountering on a daily basis that are preventing them from being successful. I know that at the Graduation Matters Montana event that I was just at earlier this week, they focused significantly on students being really embedded in the community planning groups for Graduation Matters, these cross-sector community planning groups. And at this gathering, it was led by students, and student voice was there. And you know, there was even a great video that students had put together about why graduation matters. And so, you know, that not only communicates to the folks in the room, but it's a peer-to-peer kind of engagement as well. So I think it was pivotal to their success, and I believe it's actually very pivotal to any kind of collective impact success.
Great. Thank you, Liz. We have a few more. And again, we'll encourage you to ask any questions you'd like or send reflections, whether that's through the question box or directly to Devin on Twitter. So Liz, this came from Jennifer Moriarty. She says, I read that trust is now a fourth precondition. Can you comment on that? And this was in the FSG webinar series that she recently attended.
Huh. I haven't seen that, Jennifer, so thank you for that. I'll take a look at it. But I actually believe it's a really important, it could be a pivotally important precondition. It is one that we talk a lot about at Tamarack. Stephen Covey has said that collaboration grows at the speed of trust, and so if we don't have trust around our tables, then we actually, that can really hamper our collaborative work moving forward. Trust is also really important from an equity perspective, right? Because in many of the issues that we're trying to utilize the collective impact framework to move the needle on, there can be power imbalances in those issues, right? So we really have to look at what are the strategies, what are some of the governance strategies that we're going to put into place so that we can have open and honest conversations about, you know, that issue, that problem, or that opportunity, so that everybody feels like they can contribute, everybody can share the knowledge and wisdom that they have, and so and that the Collective Impact Initiative can really harvest this collective wisdom to be able to move it forward. So I hadn't heard that. I will look it up, and I think that's a really nice addition to kind of thinking about the preconditions, and it ties really nicely into, I think, the other three preconditions around influential champions, urgency, and adequate resources.
Great, thanks, Liz. This is also from Jennifer. She says, I thought I understood that FSG now says that equity should be added to the 5 phases. So you've sort of already commented on this, Liz, but do you agree with that, or can you comment on it?
Well, you know, I can. Collective impact is a little bit of a work in progress, right? That it is something that is evolving all the time as FSG and Tamarack and others in other countries are really looking at how communities are embracing the framework and living up to its potential. So I do know that equity is the first principle of practice. So FSG has just launched earlier this year, I think a couple of months ago, a document called Collective Impact Principles of Practice. Tamarack was a co-signatory on the Principles of Practice, and the first principle of practice is this notion of equity and embedding an equity approach into the collective impact work. So I haven't seen it across the phases yet, but I do know that it is a critical part of the Principles of Practice.
Great, thanks, Liz. We have another question from Tara Mucci. She asks, is Tamarack providing the same collective impact coaching as InnoWeave, and can our initiative tap into both supports?
So InnoWeave, I think I understand InnoWeave. If you attend an InnoWeave workshop, that you have the ability to get some coaching supports from the InnoWeave, from attending an InnoWeave workshop. Tamarack does provide coaching supports, and if you are a group that is funded through the Ontario Trillium Foundation Collective Impact Granting Stream, part of that funding is also access to some coaching supports through that funding. So there is the possibility of getting coaching supports as well through the capacity building that the Ontario Trillium Foundation is providing around collective impact, because I should mention that the Ontario Trillium Foundation is not only looking to fund collective impact across Ontario, collective impact efforts, but they're also similarly interested in growing the capacity of our knowledge in Canada about how collective impact might unfold in Canada. Because it is a little different. The context, the political context is different in Canada. The way that we work from a federal government to a provincial government to local municipalities, governance structures are a little bit different in Canada from a political perspective. So I think the Ontario Trillium Foundation is really interested in not only how does this work on the ground with collaboratives, but really understanding how can we grow the capacity in Ontario particularly, but also looking at, it across Canada as well.
Great. Thanks, Liz. And I just want to make a correction. That last question was from Tanya Baldwin, not Tara.
Okay. Thanks, Tanya.
And another question from Tanya. Any suggestions for sustaining engagement of partners?
So that's a really good question, and one that I encounter all the time in working with groups that are moving forward in collective impact. a way to sustain engagement, and it seems kind of like, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense, is there are two ways that I think are really important in terms of sustaining engagement. One you can do up front, and one comes along as you're moving through your collective impact initiative. And so the one you can do up front and it is a tool that we use, and we'll attach this tool. Mark, if you can just write it down, we'll attach it when we send out the post email. It's called a journey map. And so a journey map is an exercise that you go through with your collective impact table, which looks at both the past, so what brought you together, what are those elements that brought you together to form this collective impact table, but also starts to begin to identify the elements of your journey as you go forward. And what's really important about a journey map is the process that you go through in doing it, but it becomes a great tool for people that aren't really great process people, right? Because there are going to be people around your table that say, enough talk already, let's get to action. And so a journey map helps you articulate, okay, so this is the time frame where, you know, just like the phases say, okay, so we've got a couple of years here and then a couple of years here. The journey map is a similar kind of process. So we're going to gather people together and build our table, and then we're going to talk about our issue, and then we're going to kind of move to action. So it allows people, and you add dates, you know, whatever dates are the dates that you have in your mind or your table agrees to into your journey map. And we've got a couple of examples in the tool that we'll send you of journey maps. So that's really helpful at the beginning, because people can see then, okay, so this is what it's going to look like over the next year or over the next 2 years, and that helps people kind of come to agreement and say, okay, I've got a 2-year commitment here, or a 3-year commitment, or whatever that means. As you're going through your collective impact work, one really pivotal way to sustain engagement is to really pay attention to your shared measurement. People will be engaged if they see progress and results. If you don't pay attention to progress and results and impact, people start to drift away from your tables. Now, it seems like, oh yeah, I get that, and it's easy to say it. It's a lot harder to do it, but I can tell you that if you pay attention to your shared measurement, if you report on a regular basis, if you look upon those as engagement opportunities, not only, you know, we're reporting on these were our results, then you engage people around, so why did they think you got the results that you got, right? So it's not only the results, but you look upon that as an engagement opportunity, and so that really does help you sustain momentum over the, I think, over the longer term. And then the final thing I want to say, Mark, before I stop talking, is that it's okay if people have to move away from the table, right? We're asking people for a 3 to 5 year commitment. So what you should be asking when you're recruiting them up front is, if they do have to move away from the table, how can they be involved in recruiting the next influential champion? And that's a really great way that they can engage in thinking about the future of the Collective Impact Initiative, something that they've been really quite significantly involved in, and also then helping to navigate some of that transition that happens normally around these kinds of processes.
Great, thanks, Liz. Okay, so we have one comment and one question. And Liz, I'll just put it to you because I know we're actually a minute over time here. So are you able to still stay on board, or should we close up and move on?
Well, why don't we just do that one question, and I will answer it very short. I'll be very short in my response.
Awesome. So I'll just read the comment quickly because it relates to what you've already previously talked about. But Tanya Baldwin writes in, collective impact travels at the speed of trust.
Yes.
And the question, let me just see here, comes from Allison Pearson. Are there good tools out there to help set up data sharing dashboard?
Oh my goodness. There are some good tools out there, and some groups that have done it really well. So you can go to the Collective Impact Forum website, and they have some tools. They have a kind of a workbook around shared measurement that you might want to access. But if you email us directly, we'll also link you to some tools. Or maybe what we could do, Mark, in the post-event email is answer that question.
Yes, that's great. And there's, so we have a couple tools that we'll send, and if any questions come in after this point, we'll be sure to capture them and send them out via the post-webinar email that we're going to send. So again, you can send me any questions that you have now or later to Mark, M-A-R-C, at tamarackcommunity.ca. Liz, thank you so much. That was incredibly insightful and very informing. As well, Tracy, for the information on OTF and the granting stream. We're going to take this time to finish off here. And I just want to remind everybody, you'll see the slide right now, that Tamarack has a variety of webinars and events that we host. One in particular that is coming up in September is our next 5-day event, the Community Change Institute, and it's in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. So that's the 26th to the 30th. And you can check it out on our brand new website. You can be one of the first to check out our brand new website. And there's a link to registering for the event or asking more questions and so forth. So please read more on the website about this event. And just to let you know, we have a series of webinars coming up. The OTF webinar series continues on July 5th with Common Agenda from 12 p.m. to 1 p.m. As well as on August 3rd from noon to 1 p.m. Continuous Communications, and the Backbone in Collective Impact, which is August 17th, again, 12 to 1.
And we will be doing a webinar on shared measurement, so you can sign up when you sign up for these as well.
Great. Okay. Thanks so much, Liz. So again, Liz, thank you so much for your insight. As we said, we will be sharing a post-webinar email with all the material related to today's call. The audio, as well as the, it actually ends up being the video of the webinar with the audio, the slide deck, tools and resources that Liz mentioned in the call. We've taken note of those. And any questions we will gather, take note of, and put them right into that post-webinar email. We'll be sending that out to everybody, not just to the particular question asker. And you know, we always appreciate feedback on the webinars. So again, you can use my email, mark@tamarackcommunity.ca, for sharing feedback or comments about today's webinar. Many thanks to all of you for joining us. Your comments and questions have helped us make this dynamic and thought-provoking conversation very real and incredibly interesting today. We're going to sign off now, so please have a great day, and we'll see you again soon.